समझ नहीं आ रहा अपने सैलरी इंक्रीमेंट का क्या करूं।
बेटा इतना क्या सोच रहा है? अपने म्यूचुअल फंड्स के एसआईपी का टॉप अप करा ले। दिस इज द राइट टाइम।
क्या? समझ में नहीं आया।
बेटा इतना क्या सोच रहा है? अपने म्यूचुअल फंड्स का एसआईपी टॉपअप करा ले। दिस इज द राइट टाइम।
अब समझा।
Mutual fund investments are subject to market risks. Read all scheme related documents carefully.
Donald Trump has a new bee in his bonnet. And this is something that begins with the letter B. This is Bagram, or Bagram as he would say. It's a big, huge airbase in Afghanistan, about 47 kilometers north of Kabul, on the route to northern areas. Northern areas across the hump, across the mountains, is the region that was commanded by Ahmad Shah Massoud. And even in Najibullah's times, or even in Soviet times of Soviet occupation, there was a lot of action from the other side because Ahmad Shah Massoud was very active. In fact, I've gone as far as Salang Pass from Kabul, because Salang Pass was what you needed to go over that hump into the northern areas and Panjshir Valley. This is an air base en route. It's en route. It's 47 kilometers from Kabul, say 70 kilometers south of Salang Pass. That's why very critically located. However, the even more important thing is that in all of Afghanistan, this was the biggest air base, one of the biggest air bases in the entire subcontinent. So that is saying a lot. India, Pakistan have big air bases. This was very big because you know what? This was built with Soviet characteristics. Why? Because it was built by the Soviet Union, and it was built not after the invasion in 1979. It was built in the 1950s. So this had a big runway. Those days, a very large, very long runway, and this was designed in such a way that Soviet military aircraft could use it. Kabul has its own civilian airport. Bagram was built for Soviet forces because Afghanistan then was a Soviet buffer state. For a long time, the British used the Afghanistan when the imperial power was in the subcontinent. They used Afghanistan as their buffer state. There was always a tussle between the British imperial power and with the Russians and later the Soviets. However, after decolonization of the subcontinent, it was the Soviets who increasingly acquired influence over Afghanistan, and that's the reason this humongous air base was built. Now, what happened to that air base, I will tell you as we go along. Let me tell you first of all, what did Donald Trump say, and then we'll see from where is this sudden bee in the bonnet or brainwave coming from. Trying to read Donald Trump's mind is always complicated because nobody knows what he's thinking. I'm not even sure he knows what he's thinking or what is the headline that he will unleash on the world today. But at the same time, there is also a simpler aspect to understanding his mind. So we will get into that as we go along. First of all, see what he said. So September 18, at his joint presser with Keir Starmer, the British Prime Minister, he said about Bagram, that we lost Bagram Air Base, that was given away. Of course, he keeps on saying that Biden lost it. Biden carried out a very bad withdrawal from Afghanistan. But he then says, and I'm quoting him, "We are trying to get it back. They need things from us." They means Afghans. They need things from us. And he says, it's an hour away from China. From China makes its weapons. Right? Then on September 21, on a Truth Social post, he again said, if Afghans don't give Bagram Air Base back to those who built it, the United States of America, bad things are going to happen. Those last 6 words are written in all capital letters. That's why I spoke those out. I read those out so slowly. That is typical of Trump. When he wants you to understand what is coming after, then he puts that in capital letters. So once again, if Afghanistan doesn't give Bagram Air Base back to those who built it, the United States of America, bad things are going to happen. And then it's signed DJT, Donald J. Trump. Now the fact is, when you talk about Donald Trump, you have to also carry out fact checks as you go along. So first of all, this base was not built by the Americans, most certainly not. It was also not built 25 years back. This base was built almost 75 years back. And it was built by the Soviets, not by the Americans. Second, in the agreements that the Americans signed with the Taliban for withdrawing their forces, and those agreements, the Doha agreements, were mostly, almost entirely finalized while Trump was still president. In fact, bulk of the US forces had already withdrawn, and Trump had said in November 2020, that is before he lost power, he had said that all American troops will be back before Christmas. That didn't happen. A few thousand were left behind, but he had said they'll all be back before Christmas. And in the Doha Accords, there is no mention of any American presence remaining in Afghanistan, least of all about them holding an air base there. So once again, he can now blame Joe Biden, but the fact is that Doha Accords were all negotiated and finalized under his watch. And there was no deal about the Americans keeping any bit of Afghan real estate with them. Americans just wanted out. And there was no talk of keeping the Bagram air base. But Donald Trump, you don't confuse him with any rendering of the history except his own, because he goes along with his own revisionist history as it suits him. It might have made headlines now because Keir Starmer was there and it was a big event. But Bagram is something that Donald Trump talked about even in his first cabinet meeting after his inauguration, or after his swearing in, as we would say in India. On Feb 26, at his first cabinet meeting after his inauguration, he said that we can get Bagram back. He didn't exactly say that he wanted to take Bagram, but he said, he was asked a question and he said, we never wanted to give it back. He merely said we never wanted to give it back. And then of course he said that since America is paying billions of dollars to Afghans, they can make a deal. He also said that we give them billions of dollars, right? Billions of dollars to Taliban, I don't know. Maybe the Americans were holding on to some of the Taliban money. All that is a very cluttered story. I can't go into that. But we know that for quite some time now, Americans are not giving the Taliban a lot of money. They are giving them some money almost on a weekly basis. As Amrullah Saleh, the former Afghan National Security Advisor, now in exile, loyal to the Northern Alliance in particular, he had said in an audio off the cuff that I had recorded with him from wherever he is exiled now, there he had mentioned the Americans are giving the Taliban a certain amount of money almost on a weekly basis. That's like a maintenance money, or that's like protection money of some kind. Despite that, however, the Taliban are holding American prisoners or American hostages. So that money is in millions, maybe if you add it up over several weeks, it will be a few tens of millions, but billions, no. Afghan system, the Taliban government can't even absorb billions of dollars of money. So that's not being given to them. After the same cabinet meeting, he had said that since we are giving them billions of dollars of money, maybe we can get our equipment back. I'm discussing it with Pete. Pete means Pete Hegseth, the US Secretary of War, Pete Hegseth. So the Americans, when they withdrew from Afghanistan, Americans don't believe in taking their equipment away. They just fly away from a place they are abandoning and leave loads and loads of equipment behind. In fact, we recently saw this big parade in Beijing celebrating China's role in ending the Second World War, China's victory over Japanese power in the Second World War. And the Americans were then heavily reminding the Chinese that they should have thanked America. Donald Trump wrote long Truth Social posts on that. Please see them on your screen. That brave American soldiers made a great contribution, and China should have also thanked them, or should also be acknowledging their contribution. Much of that contribution towards the Chinese effort against the Japanese on land was made from Indian soil, from Assam. Americans had set up, in fact, a massive air bridge operation where they were flying big transport aircraft from Assam's air bases, which were expanded for that purpose, and they were going over the hump and dropping or delivering supplies to the Chinese. In fact, even from there, after the war, when the Americans left, they left a lot of equipment behind. And then you found that lots of businessmen from elsewhere in India, many Marwadi families, they landed up there and picked up that stuff as junk and then became multimillionaires just by selling that junk. In fact, I have also seen at one of those air bases old Super Constellation bomber aircraft left behind by the Americans. Many of the prominent Marwadi business families now in the Northeast, particularly Assam, owe their riches to what the Americans had left behind. So Americans tend to leave things behind. In Afghanistan, they left a lot of things behind, including armored personnel carriers, tanks, even some helicopters. A lot of that, whatever the Taliban can use, the Taliban have been using. We saw the Taliban line up their forces on their border or Durand line with Pakistan. That made it look like they had better equipment, more mechanized equipment and better quality mechanized equipment than even the Pakistanis. That's the stuff the Americans have left behind. So he's talking about getting it back for money. Unlikely that will happen. And also given the geography, it's very difficult. Even if the Taliban agreed to give it back, to extricate it is going to cost more than the value of that equipment. But this is just Donald Trump talking. Now Donald Trump, he does not speak in understatement. So he's described this runway. Why does he want Bagram? He says this is one of the longest runways in the world and most powerful. Very heavy concrete and steel have gone in it. You can land almost anything on it. Now the fact is, because the Soviets built it, Soviets built big, heavy stuff, big, heavy, strong stuff. It applies to everything that the Soviet system built. This runway is like that. However, this is by no means the longest runway in the world. This is a long runway at about 11,500 feet. But the longest civilian runway, forget military runway, longest civilian runway in the world is in Tibet. This is an airport called Chamdo Bamda, which is 18,045 feet or 5,500 meters. That's much longer than Bagram. Even in the US, a bunch of air bases, at least 3 of them, if not 4, at least 3 of them have longer runways than Bagram, notably the Edwards Air Force Base, which might have not 1, but probably 4 runways longer than Bagram. So this doesn't apply. He's just feeling a sense of loss. He just thinks maybe it's a seller's remorse, as they say, like there's a buyer's remorse, there's a seller's remorse, that, you sometimes might sell a painting for a certain price, right? And then a year later think, I shouldn't have sold it. This is worth something. This will become worth much more in my children's times, like that. So this is a seller's remorse. And he thinks that he can make a deal with the Taliban and probably get some presence there. The Taliban, as you would expect, were quick to respond to this. Even after the Feb 26 cabinet meeting, when Trump first talked about Bagram, Zabihullah Mujahid, who's a very familiar name in India as well, because he is a most prolific Afghan spokesperson, Taliban spokesperson, he said that Trump's reaction was emotional and he should refrain from making statements based on unsubstantiated information, because Trump had then suggested that Chinese troops were at Bagram and Chinese had some control there. And he said this is fully in control of Islamic Emirates of Afghanistan, not at all with the Chinese. Then Zakir Jalali, an Afghanistan Taliban foreign ministry official, he put a post on social media saying that both sides should engage and negotiate. Afghans have never accepted foreign military presence of anyone in our history. All other paths are open, which means we are open to making a deal. Then he also went on to add, sort of patronizingly, Trump is a good businessman and negotiator. He's more than just a politician. So Afghans left some door open for some negotiations, not about any territory. An even more interesting observation came from Mohajir Farahi, who was a deputy minister, and he quoted a verse. He quoted a verse on social media, on Twitter, on X, and the verse translated in English is, "Those who once smashed their heads against the rocks with us, their minds have still not found peace." And then he has ended this sort of Donald Trump-like, Bagram, Afghanistan. Fasihuddin Fitrat, the Afghanistan Ministry of Defense Chief of Staff has said a deal over even an inch of Afghan soil is not possible. We don't need it. And he says Afghan independence and territorial integrity are of the utmost importance. Now, Bagram has a history. Bagram has a history. The Soviets built it. But when the Americans came, this is the first air base over which they acquired control. They came in from the north because the Northern Alliance was their ally. If you've seen any of the movies on Osama bin Laden, lately The Hunt, you will see that is where the Americans first came in. As they came in, they came into Bagram. There were pitched battles around Bagram. After that, the Taliban never fought a ground battle. Then after that, the Taliban went into the guerrilla mode, where they've been very successful. This was the last battle where they exposed themselves in large numbers and fought to keep territory. Once the Americans took Bagram, they built it into a mini city. Thousands of Americans came in, then contractors came in, local employees came in. The nearby town of Bagram, which is a district headquarters, that also boomed as a result. Remember, it was at Bagram that the Americans, first of all, they set up a big jail there, and also a very controversial dark facility where they carried out interrogations of the kind that have been written about now, about which books have been written now. This is also the place, Bagram Air Base, where they made a mock-up of the house in which Osama bin Laden was living in Abbottabad. Once they figured that he was there, this is where they made a mock-up, and that's where the special forces, the Neighbor Special Forces Development Group, they carried out their practice for the ultimate raid. This was therefore a key facility. Americans then under Biden, when they withdrew from Afghanistan, they abandoned Bagram on July 1. 6 weeks later, as the Taliban took over all of Afghanistan, as Kabul fell without a bullet being fired, at that point, the Taliban came and opened the gates of the big prison in Bagram. And everybody escaped, including prominent leaders of Al-Qaeda and from many other groups. The entire prison was emptied out. Now Trump knows. Trump is not coming at this only from nostalgia. He sees some hope because his envoy for hostage negotiations, Adam Boehler, he's been visiting Afghanistan. In fact, he's the only American who's formally in touch with the Taliban. I don't know if anything is happening behind the scenes between intelligence people, but he's formally talking to the Taliban because he wants some American prisoners out. Maybe Trump thinks that he can use this route to get a deal with the Taliban so he can base at least a contingent of his forces in Bagram. Now, they can be used for intelligence, they can be used for counter-terror operations against ISIS Khorasan, which is a common enemy of the Americans, and the Taliban. I don't know, but the motive might be to have some forces there or some resources there to keep an eye or at least an ear on the Chinese, because Trump said that it is 1 hour away from there that the Chinese are making their nuclear weapons. The fact is that the border of China is less than an hour away from Bagram because it's only about 700 kilometers. The only sizable or significant nuclear facility, if you can call it that the Chinese have in Xinjiang, because that is the province bordering Afghanistan. In Xinjiang at Lopnor, they have their nuclear test facility. However, for a long time, no new tests have been carried out. So I'm not sure if that's of so much interest to him. Then if you go further north, then in a place called Hami, which is almost 3,000 kilometers from Bagram, that is where the Chinese have a bunch of their missiles. Most of the Chinese nuclear weapons are manufactured or fabricated in central China. They are not in peripheral China. However, lately the Chinese have been relocating some of their nuclear missiles in their peripheries, including Xinjiang, because as the size of the Chinese nuclear arsenal grows, they also want to scatter them, spread them, so that they are not found in one place, because everybody now is looking for first strike, second strike, third strike, fourth strike, like that. So geography also becomes your ally. The Americans worry that they don't have any access to this side of China, that if something breaks out in Taiwan Strait or in South China Sea, then it becomes a one-front situation with China. But if they had a presence, if they had a big air base like Bagram, then they could open a second front in China's backyard. And that will make things tougher for China. Now, I don't think it's going to be that easy, but there is a certain temptation. And much as Donald Trump keeps talking about withdrawing from the world and focusing on homeland security, the Cold War instinct always keeps coming back. That might be a little bit of nostalgia here. I have a quote from Dennis Wilder, who's a former CIA officer dealing with China. He's now at Washington's Georgetown University, who also makes the same point. He says, look, Lopnor, the Chinese test site, is about 2,000 kilometers away. But at the same time, current closest American base would be in the Philippines, which is almost 5,000 kilometers away. So this will be closer, as quoted by Financial Times, we should be honest. The fact is, that it's a point he also makes, that anything that the Americans want to know about what's happening with the Chinese nuclear program, they now have satellite resources. Satellites are of very high quality. They also have human intelligence. They can also eavesdrop on conversations and communications. It's not as if geographical proximity is going to help a great deal. However, we have to see what has influenced Trump's mind, and that might be something as simple as an op-ed page article, as an opinion article written by Mike Waltz, who was briefly his national security advisor and who he fired or maybe kicked upstairs as America's ambassador to the UN. That is after he had mistakenly added the editor of The Atlantic to his signal communication group, planning strikes in Yemen on the Houthis. After that, Mike Waltz was removed. In May 2021, Mike Waltz had written an article for Military Times, and that article was titled, "Why Afghanistan is Critical to the Struggle Against China, Iran, Russia." And I quote, "Bagram airfield remains our sole strategic key terrain in the backyard of 3 of our 4 competitors, Russia, Iran, China. And we have no other options in the region." Now, it makes me wonder, who's the 4th competitor? Now, there's a little bit of a juicy line somewhere there where he refers to Pakistan, where he says he's worried about Pakistan's nuclear weapons and Pakistan's ability of ensuring that these do not fall into wrong hands. However, I don't think he's talking about Pakistan as one of his 4 competitors. I suspect, although it's not mentioned in his article, but I suspect he's talking about North Korea. But then he says 3 of the 4, Russia, Iran, China. Bagram sits in the back of each one of those, which is geographically correct. However, there is a complication as well. And that complication is, how does he fly to Bagram? How do the Americans, the mightiest air force in the world, how does it fly to Bagram? It has to either go over Iran, which is enemy territory for it, or it has to go over Pakistan, which is not always enemy territory. It can be friendly territory, but there will be a price to be paid for that. And why would the Taliban, who are at odds with the Pakistanis now, why would the Taliban let a deal go through where the Pakistanis get their tribute as well? Because Pakistanis will not do it for free. So this is not as simple as Trump is making it look like. But then you know what? Trump talked about taking Greenland. He talked about taking the Panama Canal. He talked about making Canada his 51st state. All he ended up doing was, at least for his official purposes, renaming the Gulf of Mexico, Gulf of America. So he does a lot of these things. These are trial balloons. However, what he's done is now, he's brought back Afghanistan in global headlines through Bagram Air Base, and has also brought into focus the importance of this piece of real estate, which has contributed to so much misfortune for the Afghans, because they've been stuck between superpowers and they've forever chronically been the victims of Cold War.